President spoke about 10,000 labor inspectors. He never allocated any money for it. They were clapping hands for it, yet it's not budgeted for, which means that what the President said doesn't matter. The personal income tax adjustment, it's a very welcomed position. At least the workers will now have some money in their pockets. But to save 1.4 from the fiscal, it doesn't mean anything, because saving 1.4 doesn't reduce the price of bread. The price of bread is still high, the electricity is still high. He keeps on speaking about partnership between private sector and the public sector. We've seen it happening in the electricity. Did that adjust the electricity price? No, the electricity price has increased. So the private sector has never helped anywhere to reduce any cost. If anything, the costs go high. That's why he says he's going to put more money in the transport infrastructure, bring the private sector so that it can reduce the cost in the railway. But it's not true that the private sector never reduces any cost. If anything, they are profit driven. Well, we have to allocate more money in an infrastructure and build the state capacity and not be driven by all the desire to impress the IMF, wherein the people are not at the center of your budgeting, but if anything, is the so-called investors who are being impressed with this budgeting when the people on the ground are suffering. So we will concentrate more in the investment in the infrastructure, building state capacity so that we can create more jobs and ensure that we employ as many young people as possible. Let's see if eventually the University of Ekurhuleni will happen, because they've been speaking about it, but if it happens, good for all of us, because we've been waiting for it.
We're making budgeting boring again. There's some big DA policy wins in this budget. I think first and foremost, the fact that we're finally giving South Africans relief, we're not increasing personal income tax or value-added tax, is very positive. And not only that, what's now been announced is an inflation-related adjustment to the income brackets, which means if you get a bit more money, you don't move into a higher bracket and just lose your increase from your employer to taxation. Likewise, we've seen the threshold for registering for VAT increased from 1 million to 2.3 million, which is the first increase in almost 20 years, and is a big step change in how we think about incentivizing and encouraging small organizations to get started without overburdening them with administration. That VAT threshold increase is part of a package of no less than 22 different types of tax thresholds and limits that have been increased in a positive direction. So some big wins in there. Some concerns remain. We've been provided with a division of revenue, or a special appropriation bill that's requiring 5 billion rand in additional allocation to PRASA, and specifically to a division within PRASA. It's got to do with their so-called rolling stock renewal. It's a division and an organization riddled with corruption.
Is that a special appropriation that you support?
Well, we'll have to scrutinize it in coming days, understand what's being proposed, and then we will have to make an assessment. What I can tell you is the DA is deeply concerned about PRASA and this so-called rolling stock renewal. It will require scrutiny, and we will have to make an assessment of whether this is in fact something we can support.
The minister today was using the budget to campaign. You'll recall that last year they wanted to increase the VAT. That is why the budget was tabled in May instead of in February, because they wanted to increase the VAT. And when they wanted to increase the VAT, they did say because there's a budget shortfall. Now you ask yourself a question, hardly a year later, there's nothing fundamental that they're saying it's a new revenue stream for the country. So the question would be, last year, what necessitated that the VAT be increased? Also, if you look at the manner in which they always do things, is that during the election year, everything is smooth because they're using it to campaign. Immediately after, the year after, that is where they are trying to increase the budget, they increase the other issues. So our view is that what should have happened today is that the minister should have dealt with the key issues. The key issue here is that there's a structural inequality which the budget should be used in terms of ensuring that, for example, SMMEs are prioritized in terms of government spending. Some tenders from 10 million downwards are set aside for SMMEs. Also, there's a crisis of malnutrition and poverty, especially in the Eastern Cape, whereby you've got people that even take their own lives because they can't continue suffering in our country. Now, for the grants only to be increased by 80 rands in such an environment, for us, it shows how the government it is not caring. So for us, the budget was well expected to be like this because there's nothing fundamental from the past 10 budgets that have been presented. The only difference that we're facing here is that it's an election year, they are using the budget to campaign.
No, I think unless it's a good surprise, you don't want bad surprises. We had one last year, and it didn't go so well. In fact, the adjustments to the budget were only finalized in January this year. So as the Speaker said, it was a lot of. But I'll mention just 3 things with this budget, because you're on EWN. If you live in Johannesburg, there's an additional 5 billion rand for PRASA. PRASA is manufacturing trains with Gibela, which have been sitting around turning into white elephants. When those are deployed because of the signaling equipment, people will be able to get a train every 10 minutes at peak time, which is what people need to also bring down the cost of living. The second thing, because I am from the Eastern Cape, the Nelson Mandela Academic Hospital gets an oncology unit. People used to travel to East London and to Durban for cancer treatment and so on. So I think that it's great. The third thing that I would say is that we still need, the minister spoke about composition of expenditure. It's really important. We still spend about 900 billion on salaries. We spend about 440 billion on social grants, 430 odd billion on paying down debt. We need to change that so that we can invest more in health, invest more in education, invest more in infrastructure. Otherwise, overall, steady hand at the wheel.
Well, I think largely it does bring hope to the nation, and as I indicated earlier, the ship of state finances is slowly starting to move in the right direction. Public debt is still very high. In fact, it's gone up 1% from 77.8 to 78.9% of GDP. That is a bit of a concern. However, linked to that is the fact that the minister announced that the first time in 17 years there's debt stabilization. We have to reduce debt, and the only way you can do that is by economic growth. So the economic growth is as projected, but it is still too low to address high levels of unemployment. And again, I don't think enough was said about bringing in the private sector, with private sector capital investment, together with the public sector. I think that is the way to go for faster economic growth. But at the end of the day, we are very pleased that there were no major surprises. In fact, what was penciled in last year was the 19 billion rand possible tax increases. Due to SARS improving its collection, that is no longer necessary. So there was no tax increases, personal tax increases, corporate tax increases, and no VAT increases. And that is very important, and that we welcome.
Well, it's an elections gimmick. Let me tell you for a fact. We sit with the HSA every day. Millions of the money, even the little that we have, we're not spending it correctly. Municipalities are not spending it correctly. It's being misappropriated, and the government has got a low appetite for consequence management. It does not act decisively to deal with that. But more so also, we are sitting at about 9% equity share to municipalities. That's the front line of service delivery. That is why we're proposing that it should be doubled to about 18 to 20%. So you must put more money at a local level to ensure that there's infrastructure development, to ensure that there's basic services on the front line of our people. But also couple that with ensuring that there's a high energy for consequence management. Because without consequence management, you can announce billions and trillions. They will go into individuals' pocket. Government is planning to get monies for their local government elections and to fund that through backdoor arrangements. So it's not an ethical government. It's not to be trusted with anything that they are saying.